Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about health and illness in the Hispanic population. And again, to begin, as we have with all of these conversations, when we start looking at different races and ethnicities, we have to be asking questions such as, is Hispanic actually a race? Hispanic, like all races, is a pan-ethnicity. It's a grouping of people from all kinds of different countries. Latin America has a completely different racial system than the United States. They have something called the color gradient. So it's all about how light you are. So the lighter your skin meant more access and more power. The darker your skin, less access and less power. For example, people from Africa never had a chance in Latin America. But if you were European mixed with Native American, that was more acceptable and you could become a middle class person. But only someone who was from Europe and it had pure European descent, which there's no such thing as pure European descent, but that's how they would talk back in the day. The idea that you're from Europe and you have European ancestry, that gave you the power that you needed to take an upper class social position in Latin America. They have races in Latin America you've never heard of, such as mulatto, African mixed with European, mestizo, European mixed with Native American, African Panamanian, mostly African, with a little bit of native. Honduran, mostly native, with a little bit of European and a little bit of African. You probably never heard of these words because in America we don't recognize these words. To us, it doesn't matter if you're in Latin America. If you're from Latin America, you're not allowed to be white. That's the way they look at it. So because Latin America is so blended. So if you're from Venezuela, you can't come to the United States and check the white box because again, people in the US want privilege over everybody on the planet. So of course they're not going to let Latin Americans have rights, right? So again, this is kind of where the word Hispanic came from. So Hispanic was not actually a word until about the 1950s and 1960s when people from Latin America wanted to group together to fight for some political power. So they came up with this grouping, this category called Hispanic, so that they could try to bond people from Cuba and people from Venezuela and people from Chile into one group that would vote together, albeit none of them had anything in common. And a Mexican person does not think they're the same race as someone from Puerto Rico or somewhere from like Venezuela or Argentina. A Mexican person thinks their race is Mexican. Okay, that's just the way it is. So if I'm talking to a Mexican person, the word Hispanic might be a swear word. Again, just like saying the word black in Africa can be a very bad word, using the Hispanic around a Mexican can also be a very bad word. So again, we need to question the ways we categorize people. But again, the word Hispanic, the origin of that comes about when Latin Americans were trying to come together under a single voting group to get some power to overcome prejudice and discrimination against people from Latin America. But again, what does someone from Latin America want to be called? And who cares what someone from the United States wants to call them? What does someone from Latin America want to be? Do they want to be Latino or Chicano or Mexican or Hispanic? Okay, we need to find out. We need to ask. You can't just assume that someone's Hispanic. Okay, you have to ask questions. Um, so Hispanic is a pan ethnicity. So again, when we take this biopsychosocial perspective, there's no such thing as a race of Hispanics. Okay, but there is an ethnicity of people that share some common cultural descent. Okay, and you got to think about all the cultures in Latin America. How many are there? You had native cultures, again, mixing with African and European cultures. In America, of course, we did cultural imperialism and wiped out that African culture. But that African culture was able to gain a foothold, especially in the island cultures, for example. And so a lot of those traditions were able to uphold. And so that blend of Native American and European and African cultures all blend down there in Latin America. And so that's again the color gradient because everything is somewhat blended and everyone is so blended that they needed more categories to really specifically dictate which social class location you were allowed to have. Okay, but again, when we look at Hispanics in the United States, again, we need to look at the history, the struggle, the taking of Mexico, the taking of California, and the Spanish American War. Again, so we incorporated parts of Latin America into the United States, which then incorporated entire groups of people, which then incorporated that culture. And the Latin American culture still, penetrates America very much so, as with all other cultures do. Okay, so again, Asian culture, African culture, all of these are penetrating America, influencing the way we think. Okay, but definitely Hispanic culture, and we share a border. So again, there's a lot of migration and immigration things like that that is causing and creating this cultural exchange. Okay. So again, when we look at someone who's Hispanic, you can't just assume they all share a common way of life because that's not accurate at all. It all depends on where they grew up, who they were exposed to, the socialization process, what country they're living in. All of these factors are associated with your culture. Okay. So again, the history of Hispanics in the United States, again, same with most races, subjugated into the lower classes, denied access, prejudice, and discrimination. Now, again, attitudes have improved over time dramatically, and it's so great that that's happening. But still, you see this back and forth: pro-immigration, anti-immigration, pro-trade, anti-trade, and so it just goes back and forth. Okay, so that racial conflict still exists. Currently, 60.7 million people that identify as Latin American in some way, shape, form, or fashion, 17.3% in the United States. Okay, but again, what's the proper name? Hispanic, Latino, Chicano, Mexican, what's acceptable, what's not? And it might differ between groups because every group probably has their own way of categorizing themselves. Okay, but again, the Hispanic ethnicity goes from Spain, but that wasn't the OG. Okay, the Native American cultures, and then the countries of origin: Mexico, Venezuela, Puerto Rico, Chile, Ecuador. Everybody has a unique perspective depending on where they're coming from. There's a very diverse culture in Brazil, which is significantly different than in Venezuela. In Brazil, they speak Portuguese. They might have a Portuguese way of life, also mixed with the African way of life. And in Venezuela, they might have more Native American mixed with the Spanish way of life, for example. So again, as you're starting to see, hopefully, the common themes across all races, ethnicities, even though races are inaccurate the way we code them, they still have a real effect on people's life. So again, identifying as Hispanic or whatever you identify with has a real effect on the way you think, the way you life, the way you live, and your attitudes toward health and illness. Now, Latin American culture did not go through the decimation as much as other cultures in the United States. I would say that Latin American culture and Asian culture, some of them were able to hold on a little bit better because they weren't persecuted as much as African culture was, for example, in the United States. So you still have a lot of that influence. But then again, how much was Latin American culture influenced by European colonization? Why is Catholicism such an influence to people in Latin America? And again, that didn't exist before colonization. So again, you do have that balance between the cultural imperialism of Europe and then the traditional way of life that was there pre-Europe, and then the result of the blend of the two, which is modern times. Okay, so again, traditional definitions depend upon the culture of reference, and how they all affect each other. Okay, because they all intersect. European culture with Native culture with African culture, they're all intersecting. But some common beliefs: luck and health are very important. Reward for good behavior is being healthy. Health is a gift from God. Definitely with the prayer, and again, turning to spirituality along with rituals and trinkets, relics in the home, and again, the looking to nature with the herbs and spices. So again, that common theme of looking to nature for answers to health and illness is historical, going back millennia, pre-medical technology, looking also to the spiritual side to be able to cope with health and illness. And then in modern times, that balance between, um, the balance of earth and spirit and medical technology. Okay, so classic causes of illness, they were highly influenced by the humors in Latin America. The idea of the body's imbalance as hot, cold, wet, and dry, and the humors: blood, yellow bile, flagellum, and black bile. Okay, and the idea is to keep all the humors balanced. If the humors are not balanced, then that tends to send you into illness. The book talks about being giving birth as a hot experience. Therefore, to treat, any problems with birth, we need something that's cold. Penicillin is considered a hot medicine. Therefore, that needs to be treated only to treat cold diseases, for example. The book talks about cultural ideologies such as dislocation of the parts of the body, empacho, being food stuck on the wall, should be treated with massage, caída de molera, dehydration due to diarrhea, but in their culture, it was assumed that it was because of someone touching the back of the baby's head, because there was a little bit when the baby gets dehydrated, something happens with the skull, for example. They also looked at magic or supernatural causes of the body, strong emotional states, and envidia, hence envy, envying someone else's life. The religious rituals were commonly used for health and illness, making promises to God or a saint, for example, visiting shrines, offering medals and lighting candles, offering prayer. Okay, they had folk healers called the Quandero or Quandera, holistic healers treating the whole body, mind, body, and spirit. Okay, they're applying the Quandorismo, the medical system for biopsychosocial issues. Quanderos or Quanderas are born into it, or they get apprenticed into it, or there's a calling. The book did a great discussion of midwives, which definitely look into that because that's something that's still around in these modern times. Giving advice to pregnant women, giving physical aid and treating any illnesses during pregnancy, giving the woman helping her with nutrition and activities, attendance during labor and delivery. Uh, Again, the book talks about prevention and restoration with herbs, rituals, massage, cleaning of spirits. Again, that blend of looking to nature for solutions and looking to spirituality. So again, current health problems in the Hispanic population, again, with all minority groups, we have to be looking at the effect of poverty. Okay, poverty for Hispanic Latina women, for example, make less than any other minority group. Less than Asian women, less than African American women, less than white women. And you got to ask why. How much of this is influenced by poverty and how much of this is influenced by culture, such as patriarchal ideologies, male dominated society, for example? You have to ask some of these questions. So, how is a person's socioeconomic status associated with their race and their sex? And then, how is your socioeconomic status associated with your access to healthcare? Okay, and then looking at the diversity of culture, how does cultural beliefs influence your ideology toward health and illness and your methods for treating and preventing disease? Language as a barrier is something that must be considered because, again, people that don't speak the dominant language often, come up against these barriers, such as language, where they can't communicate what's actually happening effectively. And we have a mandate to go help that. Okay, again, the effect of poverty influencing your neighborhood, how is that associated with your overall health of your risk factors for disease, for example? And then the book did talk about time of day. Different cultures have different attitudes on what should be and when should be and what is punctual and what is not punctual. And so I thought that was really interesting, the book talking about that, just some anthropological cultural facets there. Thank you again so much. Please email with any questions.